Okay, I think we may be finally live here. Hopefully some questions will start to appear. This is Scott Parazynski. I'm a former NASA astronaut, had the good fortune to fly on 5 space shuttle missions and conduct 7 spacewalks. And I also actually trained for some time with Scott Kelly. We were at one point assigned to STS-118 together. He was the commander and I was going to be the lead spacewalker on the mission. And it was only in the aftermath of the Space Shuttle Columbia accident that I got moved to another flight. But consider Scott a good friend, and I'm really excited to have him back home. I know he's had just an extraordinary mission up in space. And it looks like we've got a bunch of folks coming online with a bunch of questions, I hope, here. This is my first time using this system, so I apologize for the slow start here. And got a lot of hellos here, but looking forward to some questions. Let's see here. All right, a lot of folks logging on. This is great. Yeah, so the human body undergoes an incredible transformation when it first arrives in space. You know, being in space is an extraordinary human experience, but it's also almost like going on holiday. Your muscles and bones don't have to resist gravity. Your heart doesn't have to pump against gravity either. So it's actually quite easy on the body. The biggest challenge is actually when we come back home to Earth. And let me slow down here and get a few of your questions going. But I think it's going to be quite interesting to see how all the countermeasures that NASA and the international partners have developed to allow astronauts to live and work safely in space and come back home have helped Mikhail and Scott, because they'll have been exercising 2.5 hours a day to maintain their muscle integrity and their heart function. And I predict they're actually going to do quite well. But over the next several months, we'll be looking at the data, looking at Scott and Mikhail's readaptation to Earth's 1 gravity, and then hopefully adjusting our countermeasures to one day allow an astronaut crew to go all the way out to Mars. So let's see. Let's take a couple of questions here. Tough to read this. Okay, so I have a question from Yvonne Visser. What is my expertise? Well, when I was hired as an astronaut, I was already a physician and a space physiologist, and I had been working on exercise countermeasures to help astronauts live and work in space for long periods of time. So actually, some of the countermeasures that have been developed in the years that have followed have really helped our astronauts stay healthy in space. We have bike ergometers, we have a rowing ergometer, and then even a full exercise gym up aboard the International Space Station. It's not possible, obviously, to take a stack of weights with us and pump iron in the traditional sense, so they use a hydraulic system that allow the crew to have resistance and get a good workout in. Let's see here. So looking at do radio blackouts matter? This is a question from Brian Sekol, and a good question. Yes, we do have brief periods of radio silence, not only as the spacecraft comes back down to Earth, but even on orbit. There are periods of the orbit where we don't have good direct line of sight to the International Space Station. So there are brief periods when the crew can't pick up the phone, so to speak, and talk to mission control. But it's pretty brief, actually. In the earlier days of the space program, especially prior to the shuttle program, there were long periods of time when the crew could be out of radio contact. And so we actually have very detailed procedures such that if systems were to go awry, we would have the wherewithal to solve the problem and hopefully continue the mission, or at least stabilize a problem until mission control could gain insight and help us get to a final solution. Check out for another few questions here. Let's see, got folks from all over the world. This is really great. So we've got James Tyndall. Interesting question from him. referring to encountering aliens on any of my travels. And the answer is no, James, have not been visited by little green men. But I do think it's important to keep an open mind. And of course, we have all sorts of satellite as well as ground-based observatories detecting exoplanets in star systems very distant from Earth. And so the conditions for life are almost certain to exist elsewhere. And it's my firm belief that there is life elsewhere in the universe. We just don't have the detection capability to say where they are. And the distances are so vast. And we understand that the speed limit, so to speak, to travel between our locations is the speed of light. So it's still quite a long journey for anyone to come visit. But we need to continue to look for other habitable places. And it would be really transformative, I think, if we were to discover life elsewhere and understand how it might have evolved independently or been seeded in some way from a common life source. So I think that's one of the greatest, most profound questions that humanity faces these days. And I'm really excited about the near future because hopefully we'll be sending human crews to the planet Mars in the not too distant future, perhaps in the next 20, 25 years, and even robotic probes to Europa or Enceladus or Titan that actually have frozen water with heat sources as well. So what if there are actually primitive life forms underneath the icy, crusty surface of those moons within our own solar system? So that's going to be really, really exciting to see. Is Planet X real? Asks Tara Williams. And yes, we believe so. In fact, there's so many different planetary bodies that are in the environment of our Earth's sun that probably have yet to be detected. The more we look, the greater our sensitivity. We're finding more and more minor planets. Of course, the asteroid belt is chock full of rocky planets and places that we hope to one day go explore. Let's see here. Okay, so Karen Acosta Carranza asks, can you please talk about dreams in space? Well, it's interesting. Actually, my dreams in space are very, very vivid. I'm not sure if it's just because I'm just so excited to be there. It's such an extraordinary place, and the physical experience of floating freely is so dramatic. But I would also say that the periods that we actually sleep in space are fairly limited. Since we're not working as hard up in space physically, our muscles and bones don't have to resist gravity. And also, I think because the adrenaline is so much higher, we only sleep for 5.5, 6 hours, at least on a shuttle flight. I'm sure the long duration crew members like Scott Kelly are getting a normal 7.5, 8 hours of sleep a night. But for me, I was just so energized to be up there, and it was such a short period of time on my shuttle flights. The longest I was up in space was about 17 days. That my sleep periods were fairly brief, but I do recall that I had really extraordinary dreams of flying, which I was actually physically doing at the same time, so that's pretty cool. Can we grow potatoes in space? Asks Ravish Sharma. Interesting question, and in fact, we've actually very recently had the first full plant cycle, a life cycle of flowering plants up aboard the International Space Station, and we've been doing plant research all the way back to even the space station Mir days. And I remember visiting that space station on STS-86. It was 1997, I believe, and they had a beautiful little greenhouse. It was vibrant green with, I believe, wheat germ that was growing there. But I would imagine that it would be possible to grow potatoes in a hydroponic environment aboard a very complex, bioreactor up in microgravity. But if you've seen the movie The Martian, you probably have some ideas there as well. Soil really helps to grow plants like that, and you need lots of real estate. So I do think that in the not too distant future, when we do start to colonize, hopefully the moon and also Mars, we'll be able to create actual farms that would not only produce plants for the crew to eat, but would also help regenerate the atmosphere, take the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and actually generate oxygen for the crew to breathe. So that's going to be really important technology for the future. Let's go on here for a few other questions. Let's see. Okay, so Ray Addison asks, do you see the shuttle program or anything similar ever returning? Well, there are a lot of really exciting things happening in commercial spaceflight right now. You're probably familiar with SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin, Sierra Nevada, Bigelow Aerospace. These are all companies that are investing in access to low Earth orbit, and so building capsules that will one day take not only government astronauts to the International Space Station, but even tourists one day to suborbital space and perhaps even orbital space, or even hopefully the moon in the not too distant future. There is one winged vehicle that's very actively in development. It's being built by Sierra Nevada, and it's a really exciting spacecraft that has the ability to fly itself back to a runway, and so it has what we call cross range as it comes down back to Earth, and so that's the closest vehicle in the pipeline right now. We certainly do miss the space shuttle, its enormous carrying capacity, the ability to take large crews as well as large payloads up into space. But it'll probably be quite a while before we get anything close to replicating that. Let's see here. Got people from Mexico here and India. This is great. Here's an interesting question from Nate. How long until space sickness can set in? Well, it's really amazing how quickly motion sickness can affect a crew. And in fact, when we would launch on the shuttle, we were always told, don't take any abrupt head movements. Don't try and be a space gymnast as soon as you get up in space, because those movements can actually be very provocative. And people, even people who are still strapped in, say that the pilot up in the front right seat of the shuttle, if he or she is too abrupt in their motions, that can actually induce nausea and you can get very sick. So what a lot of the mission specialists did, we would take a medicine called Fendex, a combination of Phenergan and Dexedrine, on the launch pad, and that would actually help suppress any motion sickness that we might experience once we first got up into space. The two front seaters were not allowed to take that medication just out of fear that it might suppress reaction time in some subtle way. But as long as you were very careful not to be too aggressive once you first got into space, typically you could avoid really severe motion sickness. If you did develop motion sickness, we had great medicines. I would typically, as the crew medical officer, give folks a small injection of Phenergan right before bed on flight day one, and they would sleep like a baby, and the next day they would get up and they'd be 100%. And that's how it worked for most people. Let's see. So Claudia asks, do you feel tired? I guess your body feels different coming back to Earth. Regarding coming back to Earth, yes, it's a very, very exhausting experience on the human body, and especially for Scott and Michael coming back on a Soyuz. It's a very high G, very violent, actually, reentry process. And all of a sudden, after 340 days in space, they're feeling their full body weight. You feel like a 100-year-old man, quite honestly. And so for us shuttle flyers, after a couple of weeks, we would very slowly get up, and we would get out of our orange pumpkin suits. And by the time the crew got to the side hatch, I typically was feeling, I'd say, 75 or 80% there. The rescue crew would hand in some bottles of water, and by the time we actually crawled out the hatch and were in the transfer vehicle, I was feeling 85 or 90% whole. But I understand from the long duration crew members that it can take quite a bit longer. And in fact, the crews will be in essentially physical rehab for the next several weeks to months as they get their land legs back, get their inner ear, their gyros back. They have to be very careful not to overdo it in the gym. It's been a problem with Type A astronauts to want to get out and start running again and doing all the things that they did before flight, and that's when people actually get hurt. So we try and coach our crew members when they come back from these long flights not to overdo it. But yes, it's very, very fatiguing for the crews. Let's see. So Peter asks, what are the biggest mental challenges with being in space? Is it harder on individuals, or is there team strain? Really, really cool question, Peter. And yeah, there are strains in a lot of different levels. Quite honestly, working as a high-functioning team, you want to exceed all of your mission goals, and things don't always work per the mission plan. So we tend to hire very resilient, resourceful MacGyver-type people to work through those challenges. And those are some of the most exciting things that we get to do in space, is working in a team and solving problems. But I think especially for the long-duration crews, you're away from home for many, many months. The communication tools that the crews have now is much better than when I was flying. But they can actually pick up an IP phone and talk to their families on a very regular basis. They can obviously surf the net. They can tweet, interact with people on the ground. So there's a much better connectivity with planet Earth, but you're still distant from it. You're a separate entity from planet Earth below. And so I think the mental strains and just longing to be back with your family is one of those things that can weigh heavily on crews. But the psychological support that the astronauts get on these long missions is really outstanding. Let's see. So Kenda asks, how does it feel in space? Is it safe? And how does your body work with gravity again? Okay, well, to be in space is probably the most relaxing, exciting experience you can possibly imagine. Everything around you floats. You're physically floating in 3 dimensions. You push off with your fingertips and you fly like Buzz Lightyear wherever you want to go. You can be an Olympic gymnast or an Olympic diver, just on a daily basis. You feel very, very graceful. It's just an extraordinary physical experience, and then of course you're gifted with the views out the window, seeing your planet from a perspective that you can only dream about. So it's a really wonderful life experience to be up in microgravity. But it's a lot harder when you take that microgravity away, when you start to have to carry your own body weight. Or, as the crew will have to do tonight, to come back through a fireball, feeling 5 or 6 G's of acceleration that they hadn't felt for almost a year. So it's a very physically straining experience. I know the crew's been working very, very hard doing resistive exercise and using a device called Chibis that is trying to redistribute body fluids to the lower body, trying to get primed for dealing with gravity again. But yeah, like I said a little bit earlier, you sort of feel like a 100-year-old man when you finally get back to Earth. Let's see here. So Gonzalo asked, do you ever feel fear? Well, great question. I guess the way I perhaps compartmentalize fear is I try and think about the things that I can do to address the problems that might arise. And so an example would be on launch morning. Obviously, 7 million pounds of thrust trying to launch a space shuttle off of the planet is could induce some fear in many people. But if you're focusing on the things that you can do to make it safe and successful, that's very constructive. And so, fear in and of itself doesn't really help you very much. But if you're using that uncertainty or that that brainstorming power to try and have a plan B and a plan C and so on, then you can actually manage whatever curveballs that you might face along the way. So I don't know that I ever felt terror or distinct fear, but I certainly felt a number of times that I needed to be working on plan C, D, and E, if that makes sense. Did I see aliens? Mike McCarty asks, and as I was talking about earlier, no, I sure haven't seen aliens, but I do think that it's going to be really exciting in the years ahead to go look at Europa and Mars and Titan and Enceladus for signs of perhaps even existent life here and now beneath the icy crust. And then, of course, as we're looking at exoplanets very far away from Earth, there are environments that look to be perhaps very similar to Earth. And could life exist there? I don't know. Could we actually relocate there? That would be a really exciting thing to go explore. Okay, so Sharon asks, what happens with the fluid in the eyes? So you may have heard of some visual disturbances that our long-duration crew members are experiencing. This is a really big problem. There's not really a redistribution of fluid in the eyes. For example, the condition glaucoma, that's a pressure buildup on the eyes. There's actually more of a problem in the skull behind the eyes. We're seeing in some of our crew members an increase in intracranial pressure, and that's actually changing the shape behind the eyeball, flattening it, and resulting in some change in their visual acuity when they come back to Earth. And so we're actively looking at this issue, trying to figure out its underlying mechanisms and trying to develop countermeasures so that when we do send crews off to Mars for 2 or 3 or 4 year missions, they'll come back with basically the same level of visual acuity that they had before. Let's see here. Okay, so Ricky Finn asks, any comments on the new propulsion systems? Well, there are lots of really cool things happening in the world of propulsion development. We've been working with chemical rockets for many, many years, from the early days of Mercury and the Soyuz rockets to now, of course, SpaceX and different configurations of staging to get larger masses up into space reliably and to reuse these boosters. But the technology that I'm most interested in is a plasma ion technology that was actually developed by one of my colleagues, Dr. Franklin Chang Diaz. He's a former astronaut and developed the Vasimir rocket motor, which uses a plasma ion source to basically allow continuous acceleration. Imagine if you could launch up into space, dock with this spacecraft, basically a space taxi that would go between the Earth and Mars, and you would transfer to this spacecraft, and it would allow you to have continuous acceleration all the way out to Mars, and even have the ability to turn this thing around and come back to Earth sooner if you had an emergency. So those are the kinds of technologies that I think will really be transformative when we really start to think about developing a long-term presence on Mars. It requires lots of power. In fact, it would probably use 3 redundant nuclear reactors to power the spacecraft and accelerate ions behind the spacecraft to get you to the red planet. But the advantage of that kind of a system also is that it would actually create a magnetic field around the crew compartment and protect the crew from really dangerous radiation outside of the Earth's magnetic field. When we're up, even aboard the International Space Station, we have lots of protection from the Earth's magnetic field. But when we get out of the sphere of influence of planet Earth, galactic cosmic radiation as well as solar flare energy could prove fatal. So we need to develop better shielding technologies. And one of the techniques that we could use is creating a magnetic field by use of this Vasimir system. Let's see here. Got a lot of questions about aliens, okay. So let's see. Good question from Mihai. How does the sun appear in space? And so the sun is actually a really brilliant source of light, as I'm sure you can imagine, but it's also quite dangerous to a spacewalker. When we're outside on a spacewalk, you see us always, when we're in direct sunlight, with these beautiful gold visors down. And we do that not just to look cool. It does make for a really cool photograph, but it's actually ultraviolet protection for our eyes. If we were to look directly at the sun up in space without the protection of the Earth's atmosphere, that ultraviolet radiation would actually fry a hole right in the back of our retina in a very short period of time. So we never look directly at the sun without sun protection. But it really is extraordinary. It's extremely bright. But it's really a gorgeous view, especially when we see our sunrises and sunsets. We go around the Earth at 17,500 miles an hour or 25,000 kilometers an hour, and we'll see 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets every day. And it's just an extraordinary perspective to see the sun come up from behind the Earth limb, and you see the full spectrum of light, full kaleidoscope of colors, and unlike anything you can see here on Earth. Let's see here. Okay, so here's a question from Rigo Vasquez. Any strange occurrences or situations that were unexplainable? No, everything that I experienced up in space as a scientist engineer, I've been able to explain. But one really extraordinary experience that I had was during a shuttle Mir docking flight that I took part in, STS-86, and we had just undocked from the Russian space station Mir, and it was at orbital night, pitch black. And we had to get out of the way of a Progress resupply ship that was coming up to resupply the Mir. And we're flying over Kazakhstan right at the very moment that they launched this Progress resupply ship. And I tell you, it looked like they were launching this this Progress rocket straight at the shuttle. It was uncanny. This rocket plume was coming straight up from planet Earth right towards the shuttle and the Mir after we had undocked. We realized exactly what was happening, but it was still spooky nonetheless. Another really extraordinary thing that I've seen out on a spacewalk was at the end of my 7th and final career spacewalk on STS-120. And Doug Wheelock and I were outside flying at night over Australia. And it was a phenomenon called mesoscale lightning. But essentially what this was about 1,000 square miles of lightning activity, very, very active dynamic thunderstorms over Australia at the time. And so one burst of lightning would ignite, and at the nodes of each of these bursts of lightning, other bursts of lightning would happen. And it was like a fireworks show happening right beneath us. It was just one of the most extraordinary things that I've ever seen. Jack Hall here states correctly, there's no such thing as zero gravity. Well, it's partially correct. When we're in Earth orbit, we're actually in a state of free fall where we're in a continual free fall around the Earth. So we're actually subject to the Earth's gravity, but since we have enough forward momentum, it's balancing out that energy, and inside the crew compartment of the space shuttle or space station, we're experiencing microgravity. But there's always gravity being experienced anywhere you are within the universe, actually. There are gravitational forces affecting every aspect of our universe. Let's see here. What's been My most amazing experience? Well, Kathleen asks, I mentioned just a couple of them, the lightning storm that we saw over Australia. But another really extraordinary experience was a spacewalk that I took with astronaut Chris Hadfield from Canada. We were out on a spacewalk and actually flying through the Southern Lights, and it was just amazing to be holding on just with fingertip force, traveling at these incredible velocities, and to experience the Southern Lights, these thin, wispy lights from the Southern Hemisphere, traveling up 200 or 300 miles, right in our environment. Just an extraordinary view. Let's see. I'm going to pause here for a second. I'm getting some notes that the screen may be black, and if so, maybe we can fix that here. I'll keep on going here with questions as I wait to hear from the Science Channel folks. Let's see. So Owen asks, will Scott be going back for any extended period of time again? I wish that were the case. I'm not in queue anymore. I had to hang up my spacesuit and make room for, I call them the new kids on the block. I don't feel that old yet, but there are a lot of great young talent in the astronaut office, and I had a wonderful career. So it was time for me to sort of retire from the astronaut corps, at least, in 2009. And I took that opportunity actually to go finish out a lifelong quest of mine, which is to climb Mount Everest. It took me a couple of tries, but in May of 2009, soon after I had left NASA, I was able to check that box, if you will. In terms of future ambition to go back, I would love to go experience space again. I'm really excited about the things happening in space tourism, including Virgin Galactic, and so I would give an arm and a leg if I could have a chance to even go back for a few minutes of space on a VG flight. But unfortunately, I think it's probably above my pay grade at this point to afford a ticket to do that. It looks like I'm getting word from the Science Channel folks that they're getting good video, so I don't know why some of you have reported not seeing a video stream, but we'll continue to work on that. Let's continue on with the great questions here. Thanks so much for these. Let's see. Tarandeep asks, what are the fundamental requirements to become an astronaut? Great question, and I think the answer is it's changing, and it depends. But if you wanted to become a NASA astronaut, we're actually in the process of hiring a new class of astronauts. An extraordinary number of people applied this time, over 10,000 applicants, I think a record. So to become a NASA astronaut, it requires at least a bachelor's degree in a field related to the science and engineering that we do in space. So that can be any form of engineering, medicine, chemistry, biology, physics, and so on, or a medical degree. Many astronauts, of course, have doctorates. In fact, quite a bit more experience than the minimum required, which is 3 years in your field of expertise. So it takes a lot of different skills to run a mission, and everyone that is hired as an NASA astronaut is expected to not just be in their tiny niche of what their professional background was, but for myself, as an example, I learned all about meteorology and oceanography, material science, astrophysics. These are the languages of the space program, and we have to become generalists to take full advantage of the space environment. We're sent up into space to build and operate spacecraft, but also to gather science for principal investigators on the ground. And so we need to be very broadly versed in lots of different fields. And that was really the most exciting thing for me as an astronaut, is having every day being a learning experience. I was exposed to so many different fields of science that I feel very, very gifted in that regard. But as I was saying, times are changing, and so if you wanted to, say, fly aboard a Virgin Galactic flight, the requirements are you need to pass a pretty basic physical and write a big check. That helps as well. But there really are no physical or technical requirements to go do that. And in fact, there'll probably be a number of very senior astronauts, probably even in their late 70s or 80s, getting a chance to fly. And ultimately, there will probably be kids flying. So I think the times are changing, and I think that's really exciting. Perhaps in the next 15 or 20 years, space travel will become everywhere. So we'll be able to board a space plane in Houston and be in Tokyo in 70 minutes, for example, or from New York to Heathrow in 30 minutes. We'll be using these point-to-point suborbital spacecraft to get around the planet, and all of us will become astronauts, and I think that's really extraordinary. Let's see here. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so Helen asks, what is the worst part of being in space other than missing your family? I guess there's so many, fun, incredible experiences up in space, but there are also some inconveniences. I wouldn't say it's a horrible thing, but it just is one of those things that you have to deal with. You can't put anything down. Here's my coffee cup. If I were to just let this be, the air currents would take it around the spacecraft, and I wouldn't find it for a couple of days, and I'd go to the cabin air cleaner, and it would be sucked into that, the lost and found, so to speak. So, setting up to do any kind of delicate task, whether it's changing out a computer board or fixing a piece of equipment, takes a lot of forethought. And in fact, even to, say, draw blood for a medical experiment, it would take about 5 or 10 minutes to get everything laid out. We'd have to make a big loop of gray tape, and we would put our vacutainer and our tubes and our bandages and lay them all out in the order that we're going to use them. And we'd have to have the sharps container set there as well, because not only are the things that you're working on floating, but your patient is probably floating as well. So you've got to stabilize your patient, you've got to stabilize yourself, and then you need to control the tools that you're working with. And it adds a degree of difficulty when you go out on a spacewalk, because if you were to let something go, it's orbital debris, it's space junk, and not in pretty rapid order. So everything that we work with outside on a spacewalk has to be carefully tethered. So that's the big inconvenience of working and living in space. Okay, let's see. Okay, so let's see. Mickey asks, how do you maintain your muscle mass in space? We have a resistive exercise trainer that uses hydraulic cylinders to create resistance, and a really nice set of software that also allows us to track our performance, so we can actually establish whether or not we're losing the game or actually getting stronger in space. And in fact, a number of crew members, as I understand it, have actually come back in better physical shape than when they launched. The time right prior to the flight is very, very busy, and it's sometimes tough to get to the gym in the crazy weeks leading up to a launch. So once you get up into space, it's part of your job, 2.5 hours a day to exercise. And so, if you follow the exercise prescriptions that have been sent up to you, you can actually come back in really quite good shape. The resistive exercise device that we have up on the International Space Station is reconfigurable, so you can actually do squats, you can do any type of upper and lower body exercise. And with some experience, it's quite easy to reconfigure. And it's also really important to keep your your cardiovascular system in good shape. So we have a bike ergometer and other tools up there to keep the heart pumping really well. There's a nice treadmill up there, and in fact, I believe that Tim Peake is about to run a marathon up in space, which I think is really awesome. Sonny Williams, one of my American astronaut colleagues, ran the Boston Marathon a few years ago in a not bad time, 4.5 hours or something like that, I believe. One of the things that I did on my first space shuttle flight was pretty cool. I actually rode a bike ergometer around the world. I didn't do all 25,000 miles or whatever the distance was, but 90 minutes, one orbit of the Earth. And so I can say that I've ridden my bike around the world. Let's see. Do you age faster in space? Asks Gage Lincoln. Well, actually, it's a interesting question, Gage, because in a certain sense, yes, physically you do. In fact, the physiologic changes that take place in our body, the thinning of the bones, the weakening of the muscles, the weakening of the heart muscle, the changes to our balance system are actually a manifestation of accelerated aging. These are the same types of things that happen as we naturally age. And so we've spent a lot of time developing countermeasures to those problems to help not only astronauts fare well when they come back to Earth, but also to benefit all of us down here on planet Earth that are getting older too. So the technologies that we're developing for astronauts will hopefully help postmenopausal women and others suffering from thinning of bones that happens with aging, and lots of other things that NASA is working on. But in the relativistic sense, I get this question quite a bit. Do you come back younger? If you're familiar with the theory of relativity, you might think that we would come back slightly younger after our shuttle missions or our space station missions. And perhaps on the order of a picosecond or two, we might be slightly younger than we would have otherwise been if you really wanted to look at it in that regard. But we don't approach the speed of light to any great extent, so we're not traveling at any relativistic speeds to really benefit from using that as a fountain of youth. So hopefully that question makes sense. Okay, so Jonathan asks, how many Gs does an astronaut go through when leaving the Earth's atmosphere? Well, on a Soyuz launch that Scott and Mikhail experienced about 11 months ago, they had about 4.5 to 5 Gs on their launch profile. On a shuttle flight, we were limited to what the air surfaces of the shuttle could withstand, and that was about 3 Gs. So it's actually quite comfortable on the shuttle. It's a G vector right through the chest, and so it just feels like someone's sitting on your chest, and you have to physically exert yourself to take in a deep breath. It's a little bit harder work on the Soyuz, but the exposure to these higher forces of acceleration are pretty limited, and I would liken it to a really exciting roller coaster ride getting up there. Mitchell Turner asked, do you think we'll actually survive living on Mars? I sure hope so. The trip there is going to be quite an adventure in its own right. A long journey over there, perhaps 9 months or more, unless we develop the Vasimir plasma ion engines that I described, which would allow us to get there in perhaps 2 or 3 months. But then, once we safely and successfully land on the planet, we still have a number of challenges that we need to overcome. We need to shield ourselves from ionizing radiation. And so my hunch is that we'll probably have to bury our habitats beneath the surface of the red planet. There's not a large magnetic field on Mars, unfortunately, as we enjoy here on Earth. So to protect the crew, we'll probably have to go underground to sleep and to do many of our activities, and then come out to explore. So that's going to take quite a bit of work to get these field camps set up. But But once we do that, I think it would be possible to develop a colony there. And in the very distant future, futurists are talking about terraforming, which would be to actually create a breathable atmosphere by use of the water ice that's resident on the planet right now. The tallest mountain in the solar system is on Mars. It's called Olympus Mons. It's 5 times the height of Mount Everest, and there's a lot of water ice there, and there's also a great deal of water. Here we'll get back to tracking. There's a lot of permafrost in the soil as well, so it's possible that with enough heat energy we could actually melt that water and create an atmosphere that would be breathable. But it would probably take many thousands of years to get to that point. But good question. There's some funny questions here, but I'm going to skip on over. Okay, so let's see. Yassine asks, I just want to ask, what are the basic things we should learn to be an astrophysicist? Well, it's an exciting field, and the tools available to astrophysicists today are really extraordinary, both as observational astrophysicists using assets like the Hubble Space Telescope and the soon-to-be launched James Webb Telescope, to the computational abilities that theoretical astrophysicists are going to be able to really leverage. So obviously pursuing physics in university and perhaps working in a lab or in a research group would be the best pathway to become an astrophysicist. And there are lots of great universities around the world that can help you get there. Let's see. Okay, so here's a question, thoughtful question from John Herbert. Has the money spent on the space shuttle and the International Space Station been worth it? Shouldn't it have been invested on trips to the Moon and Mars? Well, it's a question of priorities and decisions made by national space agencies and administrations over many years. But when I was a kid, I watched the Apollo program come to be, and in fact, I dreamt of becoming the very first astronaut to set boot prints down on Mars. And I certainly hoped that the program was going to be going on its way to Mars after the Moon. But there were a lot of really good reasons to pursue the space shuttle program and also the International Space Station. We established some incredible technologies and capabilities in our own Earth environment. We've used the space shuttle and space station to track global environmental change, to look at other technologies that would benefit life here on Earth as we look outward towards ultimately colonizing our solar system and places beyond. So I think we perhaps weren't quite ready at that time, back in the mid-'70s when we were wrapping up the Apollo program, to go to Mars, but I think we're getting very close. The big unanswered question, I think, for us right now is how do we keep our crews safe from the ionizing radiation that I've been talking about. And there are some strategies out there. We need to test those. We also need to develop more robust technologies in life support systems so that the crews that are living out on Mars can completely strip apart and repair and rebuild things, because we won't have the ability to send up a resupply ship and change things out as we do aboard the International Space Station. And in fact, the time latencies between here and Mars, it can be 20 minutes one way for a transmission and 20 minutes coming back. So if you've got a really burning question, you're going to have to answer it yourself if you happen to be an astronaut on Mars. So those kinds of systems and technologies we've been able to really mature in Earth orbit here with the shuttle and space station. And I think also the the new technologies that have been developed have benefited our economies and created new jobs and inspiration for many people. So really an extraordinary program. Let's see. Okay, so here's an interesting question from John Pitsy. Why not use electrical shock to stimulate muscles in the body while in space instead of using exercise equipment? Well, there are technologies that use electromyostimulation, which is basically what you just said there. Excuse me just one second here. Multitasking here. Okay, so I'm just getting a note from the Science Channel folks, and for those that are having a black screen issue, if you'd like, you can click on the picture or refresh to restart, and you should see a good video feed at that point. So you might want to try to do that if you've got a black screen now. So getting back to John's question, electromyostimulation is a way to actually cause contraction of muscles, and it is used in certain rehabilitation environments, but it can be somewhat painful, and in terms of developing the kinds of forces that you really need to preserve muscle strength and integrity and bone health, you need to have greater impact loading, and that's why we tend to prefer using the resistive exercise devices that we have aboard the station. So let's see here. So here's a profound question that I have no idea how to answer, but Luko Jordanov asks, did God create the universe? It's a very profound question, and I wish I had the tools to answer that kind of a question. Let's see here. Okay, so Ellie asks, what are the conditions of training before going into space? Do you mimic any conditions while in training? And the answer is absolutely yes. We try and make our training environments as similar. But it's not. We're not able to completely recreate the microgravity environment here on Earth. We don't have a weightless room that we can just turn off the switch and be in space and replicate everything that we're going to do up in space. So we have to create a number of different training environments that in composite give us a good sense of what it's going to be like once we finally get upstairs, as we call it. So we have a huge swimming pool called the Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory, where we can get in our white spacewalking suits and practice all the details of our spacewalks. We put on virtual reality goggles, and we can practice all the details of our robotics and rendezvous and spacewalking in that environment. For the space shuttle, we had a motion simulator that allowed us to actually feel the same types of vibration and pitch and roll that we would have bringing the shuttle back to Earth. So really a lot of different ways in which we can replicate the space environment, but until you actually get there, there's nothing like it. So let's see. I think we're almost out of time here. I'm going to take a couple more really good questions here, and then we'll have to wrap it up. But I really am excited by all the great questions that we've had here today, and maybe we can get back together on some future occasion to do this again. Let's see here. Let's see. Okay, so Lisandro Diaz asked, tell us about an experience that you will never forget while in space besides zero gravity. Well, I think the most extraordinary part about being an astronaut and being in space is working with these incredible teams. And it's not just the crew that you're flying with, but it's the mission control team and the instructors and the engineers and scientists who prepared your mission. But probably my best day on the job ever was on my last space flight when we had to go repair a live solar panel that had essentially been ripped apart during its deployment. And this is something that we couldn't have anticipated prior to the mission, and it was really one of those MacGyver moments where we had never anticipated even going near a live solar panel to go fix it, and we were in a position where we had to go do that and accept higher risk in order to make this repair happen. And over a period of 72 hours, brilliant engineers at the Johnson Space Center and around the country came up with a solution that took myself out on the end of this 90-foot-long robotic boom with Doug Wheelock at the base of the solar panel, and then Pam Melroy and Dan Tani and Stephanie Wilson and others inside the space station flying the robotic arm to effect really a brilliant repair. And so that really is the highest high that I think an astronaut can have is working with such a high functioning team on something that basically was impossible, and NASA made it almost look easy. So we'll take one last question here, and I think we're unfortunately out of time, but let's see here. Okay, so David Paxton asks, for long journeys in space, do you believe that we'd be better off with a centripetal rotating spacecraft or induced hibernation to protect the human body? Really, really cool questions, kind of 2001 Space Odyssey themes there. And, I think if we ever do consider traveling outside of our solar system, if, say, for example, one of the exoplanets that we identify well beyond our solar system perhaps could sustain human life, perhaps it has an atmosphere similar to Earth's that we want to go colonize, we'll probably have the tools in the not-too-distant future to identify planets like that. It's going to be a very, very long, multi-generational trip. And so, I think there will be some effort to really develop physiologic hibernation. It's certainly science fiction right now, but certainly possible to consider those kinds of technologies. When you start to think about artificial gravity and rotational spacecraft, these are enormous rotating wheels up in space. It's very expensive right now to get things up into space, on the order of $10,000 per pound to get something off of the Earth's off of the Earth's surface, to Earth orbit, and then even more energy and cost to get it into interplanetary space. So it's pretty cost prohibitive right now, but if we're to develop lunar outposts, for example, where the energy required to lift something off of the moon, 1/6 gravity, it's a little bit easier. So if we were to build the components on the moon and launch them from the moon, that might be one strategy to get a huge spacecraft like that up into space. But time will tell. I think certainly for things in our neighborhood, for example, Mars, we probably don't need to make that kind of an investment. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us on this chat today. I had a lot of fun. These are great questions. I'm sorry I couldn't take every single one of them, but I'd love to come back and join you at some other occasion. Please do check out Scott and Mikhail's landing tonight. I believe it'll be at 11:25 Eastern tonight in Kazakhstan, and looking forward to seeing him back here in Houston in a day or two, and hopefully he'll have a great recovery, and we'll learn a lot from his long duration flight. So take care, everybody, and thanks for joining.